The most dangerous weapon deployed by Nazi Germany to infiltrate the British Empire was not a fleet of Heinkel bombers or a wolf pack of U-boats. It was a woman armed with the title of princess. Open the classified MI5 dossiers on Stéphanie von Hohenlohe. Born a commoner, she weaponized a sexual scandal to trap a German prince, hijacked a royal crown, and forged it into the most devastating instrument of geopolitical deception of the 20th century. Despite her Jewish heritage, she paradoxically emerged as Adolf Hitler's most favored personal spy. With sheer, ruthless cunning, this spy princess manipulated London's most powerful media magnates and pulled the strings of Britain's traitorous exiled king, Edward VIII. This is a cold clinical autopsy of how an opportunistic social climber utilized a fabricated royal facade to reduce the British elite into a caste of blind, willing fools serving the Third Reich. To accurately comprehend the operational mechanics of this psychological infiltration campaign, it is imperative to objectively dissect the collective psychological state of the British aristocracy, political elite, and media magnates during the 1930s. This was a ruling class standing at the precipice of a profound crisis regarding its own social positioning and historical relevance. The pervasive anxiety generated by the rise of the organized labor movement, the ideological contagion of communism spreading westward from the Soviet Union, and the gradual erosion of hereditary privileges following the socio-economic devastation of the First World War had collectively pushed the British aristocracy into a state of chronic existential insecurity. In their desperate reactive scramble to protect their vast concentrations of inherited wealth and their monopolistic hold on political power, this elite demographic began to harbor a dangerous desire for a new authoritarian order, a rigid power system capable of restoring and enforcing the traditional class hierarchies that democracy seemed to be dismantling. Adolf Hitler and the extreme right-wing ideology of the Third Reich, with their definitive promises to eradicate the communist threat and enforce a strictly stratified social order, inadvertently evolved into a highly seductive political solution for the conservative factions of the London elite. However, the constraints of international diplomacy and the inherent caution of the British democratic system dictated that they could not publicly align themselves with a regime characterized by such overt brutality. It was precisely at this historical bottleneck that the emergence of Stéphanie von Hohenlohe served as the perfect, untraceable catalyst. This individual successfully bridged the perilous diplomatic chasm by masking clandestine political negotiations beneath the glittering, impenetrable veneer of high society socialization. Utilizing the acumen of a master psychological manipulator, she accurately assessed that the British elite might maintain strict defensive postures when confronted by a uniformed German diplomat or a declared political operative, yet they would render themselves entirely defenseless before a European princess who offered exclusive invitations to opulent galas and the promise of direct privileged access to the highest echelons of leadership in Berlin. Exploiting the hereditary snobbery of individuals who inherently position themselves at the apex of the global social hierarchy, Stéphanie established a sprawling, sophisticated network of psychological manipulation operating in plain sight within the heart of London. The execution of this espionage required no crude blackmail, no financial extortion, and no physical threats. She simply activated their inherent greed, their profound arrogance, and their insatiable desire for exclusivity. The media barons, who dictated public discourse, the seasoned politicians who formulated foreign policy, and even prominent figures occupying the very veins of the British royal family willingly stepped into this architecture of manipulation. They were rendered intellectually blind by the allure of superficial titles, delusions of their own geopolitical grandeur, and, most critically, a mutual alignment of class-based self-interest. Consequently, the historical record detailing the intelligence campaign orchestrated by Stéphanie von Hohenlohe extends far beyond the parameters of a standard counterintelligence file. It serves in reality as a comprehensive autopsy of a power structure that had already rotted from the inside out. It exposes a brutal, unforgiving truth regarding the nature of geopolitical vulnerability. The most catastrophic breaches of national security rarely originate from the inadequacies of a nation's military apparatus or the technological obsolescence of its defense infrastructure. The most fatal vulnerabilities are perpetually generated by the arrogance, the insular selfishness, and the political myopia of those who self-appoint as the guardians of the state. The betrayal perpetrated by the British elite in the years preceding the Second World War was not the result of foreign coercion. It was an act of willing, enthusiastic compromise. They voluntarily unlatched the gates of their national borders, transforming themselves into highly effective instruments for the Axis powers' ideological machinery, driven solely by the desperate need to validate their own social supremacy and safeguard their elite privileges within a rapidly modernizing world that threatened to render them obsolete. The narrative of this royal facade, therefore, stands as a damning, irrefutable indictment of the corruption inherent in concentrated power, illustrating the devastating geopolitical price exacted when the vanity of a ruling class is prioritized over the survival and security of a nation. Within the rigidly stratified social architecture of early 20th century Europe, particularly within the central power core of the pre-war Austro-Hungarian Empire circa 1914, the aristocracy did not merely operate as a governing political or economic class. Analyzed through a structural lens, this elite demographic functioned fundamentally as a monopolistic biological alliance, wherein the survival and dominant positioning of the entire system were entirely predicated upon the meticulous preservation of bloodline purity. Within the parameters of this institutional framework, the royal reproductive system was never conceptualized as a matter of physiological function or private individual right. It was, rather, a core security apparatus. It functioned as a highly sophisticated control mechanism strategically designed to consolidate geopolitical alliances, protect massive concentrations of inherited generational wealth, and, most critically, to definitively terminate any potential access by peripheral or unauthorized entities into the absolute center of power. Any reproductive anomaly occurring outside the explicit authorization of the institution was immediately classified as a severe structural liability, carrying the imminent threat of fracturing the perceived legitimacy of the entire social hierarchy. Marriage, therefore, constituted the sole authorized administrative procedure permitted to activate the continuation of this tightly sealed network. It is precisely at the intersection of these draconian biological and sociological barriers that the historical record documents the systemic intervention of Stephanie Julian Richter. Originating from a middle-class demographic background and possessing Jewish heritage, Every foundational element of this individual's demographic profile and social standing relegated her to the extreme periphery of the European power structure. Evaluated against the rigid class-defining metrics of the era, her requisite avenues for upward social mobility and any theoretical capacity to access the elite continental network were entirely neutralized by impenetrable fortresses of ethnic prejudice and strict aristocratic inheritance protocols. However, subsequent historical analyses and intelligence reviews demonstrate that this individual possessed a ruthlessly clinical capacity for observing and exploiting systemic vulnerabilities. She accurately diagnosed that the aristocracy's extreme, almost pathological obsession with maintaining the integrity of the royal reproductive system, coupled with their paralyzing terror of public relations scandals that could erode their facade of inherent superiority, constituted a fatal structural flaw. This vulnerability could be reverse engineered and weaponized into a highly systematic instrument of political extortion. The precise historical aperture required to breach this security perimeter materialized in 1914 through a definitive biological event, Stephanie Richter's unauthorized pregnancy with Archduke Franz Salvator of Austria. The Archduke was not a peripheral figure. He was a senior, highly visible member operating at the absolute nucleus of the Habsburg dynasty, holding the position of son-in-law to Emperor Franz Joseph I himself. From the perspective of institutional risk analysis, this illegitimate pregnancy did not merely represent a discrete personal indiscretion. It constituted an immediate existential crisis directly threatening the structural integrity of the royal house. According to the standard risk management protocols historically employed by the European aristocratic network, the paramount imperative of the system at that exact moment was the rapid, invisible neutralization of the biological threat. The standard operating procedure typically mandated the clandestine disbursement of substantial financial compensation, inextricably linked to the forced geographical relocation of the mother to distant borderland territories. This methodology was designed to permanently eradicate the individual's capacity to access elite privileges or attract public scrutiny, thereby ensuring the central power core remained uncontaminated by unauthorized peripheral bloodlines. However, operating in stark contrast to previous individuals who had been systematically crushed by this institutional machinery, Stephanie Richter categorically refused to be processed as a disposable variable. Instead of acquiescing to institutional silence and accepting a temporary financial subsidy, this individual executed a calculated, surgically precise maneuver of psychological and political manipulation, the direct weaponization of her own reproductive state. She systematically converted a purely biological occurrence into a negotiating asset possessing unparalleled geopolitical leverage. By confronting the Habsburg dynasty with the catastrophic prospect of exposing the systemic moral decay and the hypocritical reality of the royal reproductive system to the unforgiving scrutiny of the mass public, she effectively stripped the institution of its operational autonomy. She forced the supreme power apparatus to the negotiating table under a set of uncompromising parameters that she alone had established. The resolution demanded by Stephanie was neither momentary financial appeasement nor temporary institutional protection. Her ultimate non-negotiable demand was total, irrevocable integration into the elite system. She compelled the supreme authority to manufacture a legitimate access portal, allowing her entry into the elite network, thereby permanently reconfiguring her own demographic classification and historical trajectory. The direct consequence of this ruthless negotiation was the execution of a political marriage transaction that stands as a definitive case study in the capitulation of institutional power. The Habsburg dynasty, driven by a desperate, panicked imperative to conceal its own biological security breach, orchestrated and financed an arranged marriage between Stephanie and Prince Friedrich Franz von Hohenlohe-Waldenburg-Schillingsfürst. This specific prince, representing a lower-tier branch of the German nobility, agreed to participate in this institutional laundering procedure as a direct concession to severe political pressure and the promise of substantial financial incentives funneled from the Vienna elite. This marital union was completely devoid of any foundational elements of emotional attachment or traditional morality. It operated exclusively as a cold, calculated administrative procedure designed to retroactively legitimize the unauthorized pregnancy and issue the subject a completely new, unassailable identity. Through this singular, meticulously engineered transaction, an individual of common origin successfully bypassed centuries of rigorously enforced bloodline vetting protocols, effectively neutralizing every access barrier the aristocratic system had constructed. The successful acquisition of the title Princess of the House of Hohenlohe marked the definitive initiation of an exponentially larger continent-wide infiltration campaign. Stephanie had empirically proven a brutal geopolitical axiom. Even the most fortified, insular, and exclusionary social stratification architectures can be decisively breached, provided the attacker thoroughly understands the operational mechanics and the inherent weaknesses of the structure's biological control mechanisms. The newly acquired royal title was no longer merely a superficial designation of vanity. It had been transfigured into an ultimate diplomatic shield, granting her an unprecedented degree of immunity against conventional social prejudices and border controls, transitioning from an entity systematically denied access to a fully integrated, ostensibly legitimate member of the highest social echelon. Princess Stéphanie von Hohenlohe now possessed a universal passport. This singular political marriage transaction flawlessly fulfilled its primary objective of constructing an impenetrable facade, laying the critical foundational architecture for the subsequent rise of one of the 20th century's most dangerous and lethal power brokers, fully positioning her for the impending manipulation of the entire Western political apparatus. The ascension of the National Socialist German Workers' Party to absolute power in 1933 initiated the rapid, systematic dismantling of the Weimar Republic's democratic infrastructure. However, the true distinguishing characteristic of the Third Reich did not lie in its political authoritarianism, but rather in its unprecedented transformation of the state into a biological apparatus. The totalitarian architecture of Nazi Germany was fundamentally predicated upon the pseudo-scientific doctrine of biological determinism, an ideological framework that categorized human populations not by national allegiance, linguistic affiliation, or cultural contribution, but strictly by perceived racial purity. Within this newly engineered biostate, the concept of citizenship was entirely divorced from civic participation and intrinsically linked to the genetic metrics of the Aryan ideal. This radical restructuring of human value culminated in the promulgation of the Nuremberg laws in September 1935. These legal statutes were not mere expressions of extreme prejudice. They functioned as the supreme structural operating system of a state entirely devoted to demographic engineering. The laws systematically stripped Jewish populations of their citizenship, criminalized intermarriage, and laid the legalistic groundwork for a process of industrial-scale marginalization that would ultimately transition into the systematic mechanics of the Holocaust. The ideological purity of this biological hierarchy was publicly declared to be absolute, immutable, and the very foundation of the 1,000-year Reich. It is precisely against the backdrop of this uncompromising, lethal legal architecture that the historical anomaly of Stéphanie von Hohenlohe emerges as a devastating structural critique of totalitarian ideological frameworks. Evaluated strictly through the inflexible parameters of the Nuremberg laws, the demographic profile of Stephanie Julienne Richter, born to Jewish parents in Vienna, rendered her an absolute biological enemy of the state. According to the foundational legislation of the Nazi regime, her mere existence within the borders of the Reich or its spheres of influence should have triggered an immediate sequence of administrative and physical eradication. She was mandated by law to be expropriated of all material assets, systematically stripped of her fraudulently acquired aristocratic titles, entirely excised from the social and political fabric of the nation, and ultimately processed through the fatal logistics of the concentration camp system. Her biological heritage, according to the state's own absolute doctrine, possessed zero utility and represented an intolerable contamination of the collective national bloodstream. Yet the historical record documents an astonishing, highly calculated systemic contradiction orchestrated from the absolute apex of the Nazi command structure. Rather than being subjected to the lethal machinery of the SS, Stéphanie von Hohenlohe was actively protected, extraordinarily well compensated and elevated to the status of a premier, state-sponsored diplomatic asset. In a maneuver that brazenly bypassed the supreme racial legislation of his own state, Adolf Hitler personally intervened to shield her, officially bestowing upon her the highly anomalous classification of honorary Aryan. This unprecedented administrative exemption was not an act of idiosyncratic mercy or personal affection. It was a cold, ruthlessly pragmatic geopolitical transaction. The intelligence directorates of the Third Reich, alongside Hitler himself, had conducted a clinical cost-benefit analysis. They determined that while her biological heritage was officially classified as a lethal contaminant, her acquired sociological packaging, specifically the unassailable aristocratic title of Princess of the House of Hohenlohe, and the vast network of elite British contacts that accompanied it, possessed a geopolitical utility that exponentially outweighed the strictures of their own ideological doctrine. This targeted exemption exposes the profound hypocrisy and the Machiavellian flexibility inherent in the fascist operational model. The leadership in Berlin acutely recognized that their conventional diplomatic corps, largely comprised of ideologically rigid party loyalists and military figures, was fundamentally incapable of penetrating the insular, highly sophisticated, and overwhelmingly snobbish social circles of the British ruling class. The British aristocracy, who dictated the foreign policy of the world's largest empire, would reflexively reject the crude, violent overtures of Nazi functionaries. However, these same British elites were exceptionally receptive to the language of continental royalty. They were intrinsically conditioned to trust and engage with individuals possessing the correct aristocratic pedigree, the proper social etiquette, and the ability to host opulent salons at elite venues such as the Dorchester Hotel. Stéphanie von Hohenlohe, armed with her strategically acquired title, functioned as the ultimate ideological Trojan horse. She spoke the exclusive sociological dialect of the London elite, allowing her to smuggle fascist political objectives into the drawing rooms of the British establishment disguised as casual high society conversation. Consequently, the supreme architects of the Holocaust, including high-ranking officials within the SS who were concurrently designing the logistics of mass extermination, were ordered to function as the primary protectors and financial sponsors of a Jewish woman. They provided her with substantial operational budgets, facilitated her international travel, and even allocated confiscated properties, including the opulent Schloss Leopoldskron in Salzburg, which had itself been expropriated from a prominent Jewish family, for her personal use and diplomatic entertaining. This paradox brutally dismantles the historical illusion that Nazi ideology was a rigid, unyielding belief system. In reality, the racial laws were absolute only when applied to the powerless masses. When confronted with an entity possessing significant strategic value, an individual capable of bypassing British early warning systems and directly manipulating the media magnates and political power brokers of London, the ideological framework proved to be highly malleable, capable of instantaneous suspension in the service of raw geopolitical advantage. The Nuremberg paradox, as manifested in the survival and operational elevation of Stéphanie von Hohenlohe, illustrates the ultimate triumph of cynical realpolitik over professed ideological purity. It demonstrates that a totalitarian system, despite its reliance on absolutist rhetoric, is fundamentally an opportunistic enterprise. The regime was perfectly willing to prostitute its own supreme biological laws to secure a tactical diplomatic foothold within the British Empire. The chilling conclusion derived from this historical chapter is not merely the extraordinary survival capability of a master manipulator, but the horrifying realization of systemic inadequacy. While millions of individuals sharing her exact ethnic heritage were being systematically marginalized, hunted, and industrialized in the machinery of genocide, this singular individual was granted absolute immunity. She navigated the highest echelons of power in Berlin and London, dining with dictators and kings, protected by the very regime architecting the destruction of her people, simply because she possessed the one currency the Third Reich valued more highly than its own racial purity, the aristocratic leverage to subvert the leadership of the free world. In the complex architectural framework of modern democratic systems, the press, historically designated as the Fourth Estate, is theorized to function as the ultimate institutional safeguard against the unchecked consolidation of authoritarian power. During the geopolitical fragility characterizing the 1930s, the British mass media apparatus possessed an unprecedented, almost monopolistic capacity to shape public consciousness, dictate the parameters of domestic political discourse, and directly influence the foreign policy trajectory of the British Empire. Within this sprawling sphere of informational hegemony, the Daily Mail, operating under the absolute autocratic proprietorship of Harold Sidney Harmsworth, 1st Viscount Rothermere, stood as a monolithic entity of mass communication. Lord Rothermere did not merely disseminate daily news reports, he engineered the geopolitical reality for millions of British citizens. However, a rigorous structural analysis of this media empire reveals a catastrophic systemic vulnerability. The entire operational apparatus of this critical democratic safeguard was entirely subordinate to the personal ideological inclinations, class-based anxieties, and profound social vanity of a single, unelected media magnate. It was precisely this extreme concentration of informational power, coupled inextricably with the psychological fragilities of its proprietor, that provided Stéphanie von Hohenlohe with the optimal, uncontested vector for ideological subversion. Lord Rothermere epitomized the chronic, paralyzing insecurities of the British elite during the interwar period. Despite his vast accumulation of generational capital and his newly minted aristocratic title, his geopolitical worldview was fundamentally dominated by an existential terror of Bolshevik expansionism and the mobilized, organized working class. Rothermere, evaluating the shifting European landscape exclusively through the lens of extreme wealth preservation and elite survival, fundamentally distrusted the chaotic, unpredictable mechanics of democratic governance. Consequently, he secretly harbored a profound systemic admiration for the brutal efficiency, the suppression of labor movements, and the enforced social order explicitly promised by European fascist regimes. He required a formidable ideological bulwark against the perceived threat of communism, and Adolf Hitler presented a highly appealing, albeit diplomatically toxic, structural solution. Yet operating within the restrictive civic constraints of a democratic society, Rothermere could not seamlessly integrate himself into the inner sanctum of the Third Reich without a socially acceptable, culturally legitimate conduit. He required a diplomatic bridge that could effectively sanitize his authoritarian sympathies, repackaging them under the glamorous, unassailable guise of high society international relations. Princess Stéphanie von Hohenlohe, possessing both the requisite royal facade and verified intimate access to the absolute apex of the Chancellery in Berlin, was precisely the geopolitical asset required to facilitate this illicit alignment. The methodology employed by Hohenlohe to systematically capture the Daily Mail did not rely upon conventional espionage techniques, crude financial bribery, or overt ideological coercion. Instead, she executed a historical masterclass in the weaponization of exclusivity and the exploitation of aristocratic hubris. Recognizing that a man of Rothermere's immense, self-made wealth could not be bought with capital, she meticulously identified the single currency he desperately coveted: unparalleled, unmediated access to the absolute epicenter of European power, meticulously packaged within the deferential, archaic protocols of continental royalty. Hohenlohe positioned herself not merely as an informant or a diplomatic liaison, but as an exclusive, omnipotent gatekeeper. She orchestrated highly publicized, meticulously choreographed state visits for Lord Rothermere to Germany, where he was received not merely as a foreign newspaper publisher, but with the immense pomp, military parades, and extreme deference typically reserved for sovereign heads of state. Adolf Hitler, fully briefed by Hohenlohe's psychological profiling regarding Rothermere's acute susceptibility to flattery and grandiosity, deployed the full theatrical, propagandistic apparatus of the Third Reich to mesmerize the press baron. Through Hohenlohe's continuous calculated mediation, Rothermere was granted exclusive, highly vetted interviews with the Führer, effectively bypassing the traditional critical and objective channels of British foreign correspondence. This calculated transaction yielded immediate catastrophic dividends for the Axis propaganda machine. In exchange for the narcotic of aristocratic validation and a severely inflated sense of his own geopolitical importance, Lord Rothermere voluntarily and enthusiastically surrendered the editorial independence of the Daily Mail. The historical record demonstrates a clear systemic shift in the publication's editorial trajectory, directly correlating with Hohenlohe's intervention. The newspaper commenced publishing notoriously sympathetic articles praising the Nazi regime, actively sanitizing its domestic atrocities, defending its aggressive territorial expansions, and aggressively advocating for the British fascist movement, most infamously encapsulated in the catastrophic editorial, "Hurrah for the Black Shirts." Under Rothermere's directive, the publication functioned as an unacknowledged offshore proxy for the Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. It broadcast a carefully curated, highly distorted narrative of German rearmament and political stability directly into the living rooms of the British electorate. This constituted a profound systemic failure of the highest order. The primary early warning system of the British democracy had been successfully neutralized from within, re-engineered to pacify the public, manufacture consent for appeasement, and actively advocate for capitulation toward an existential geopolitical threat. The subjugation of the Fourth Estate was so absolute and structurally complete that Lord Rothermere formally retained Stéphanie von Hohenlohe on an exorbitant financial retainer, ostensibly compensating her for her services as an international consultant and foreign correspondent. In reality, this legally binding financial arrangement formalized her operational status as the shadow editor-in-chief of his entire foreign policy agenda. She possessed the unilateral authority to dictate the parameters of his geopolitical understanding, ruthlessly vetting the intelligence and information that reached his desk and ensuring that the narrative framing of Nazi Germany remained consistently favorable and aligned with Berlin's strategic objectives. The profound historical tragedy of this infiltration lies not merely in the operational success of the intelligence operative, but in the eager institutional complicity of the target. Rothermere was not an innocent victim of sophisticated geopolitical deception. He was a willing, active participant who allowed his own ideological biases, his terror of losing his elite status, and his insatiable vanity to completely override his institutional responsibility to the democratic public. The manipulation of Lord Rothermere in the Daily Mail stands as a definitive, chilling historical case study. It ruthlessly illustrates how easily the indispensable mechanisms of a free press can be hijacked, dismantled, and repurposed when immense informational monopolies intersect with the sociopathic ambition and class preservation instincts of the elite. It definitively proves that the most effective, lethal form of systemic censorship is not necessarily imposed by the brutal force of a totalitarian state, but is often voluntarily enacted by media barons who have been seduced by the proximity to absolute authoritarian power. Through the strategic deployment of a royal title, Stéphanie von Hohenlohe successfully transformed one of the world's most powerful instruments of democratic accountability into a weapon aimed directly at the heart of the society it was theoretically designed to protect. In the traditional orthodox lexicon of counterintelligence and geopolitical espionage, the conceptualization of intelligence gathering is frequently and erroneously relegated to the clandestine acquisition of encrypted documents, the covert surveillance of military installations, or the physical infiltration of secure governmental facilities. However, a rigorous structural analysis of Stéphanie von Hohenlohe's operational methodology in London during the critical years preceding the Second World War necessitates a fundamental recalibration of this archaic paradigm. Her primary apparatus for strategic intelligence extraction was not a concealed camera, a compromised communications cable, or a network of blackmailed civil servants. It was rather the opulent, highly exclusive, and intensely public physical space of her private residential suite at the Dorchester Hotel in Mayfair, London. This luxurious enclave was systematically engineered not merely as a domicile for a visiting aristocrat, but as a decentralized, highly efficient, and entirely unofficial intelligence node operating directly on behalf of the Third Reich. It was strategically situated within the absolute geographic and social epicenter of the British Empire, functioning in plain sight as a catastrophic vulnerability within the national security architecture. The Dorchester Hotel operation functioned as the ultimate sociological blind spot for the British domestic security apparatus. To comprehensively understand the devastating efficacy of this intelligence initiative, one must analyze the physical and psychological architecture of the aristocratic salon during the interwar period. By seamlessly transplanting the archaic, deferential protocols and the glittering aesthetics of continental royalty into the heart of democratic London, Hohenlohe created a controlled environment that inherently neutralized the critical faculties, the political skepticism, and the operational security protocols of her targets. The drawing room of her suite was meticulously transformed into a highly curated theater of aristocratic validation. Invitations to these exclusive gatherings were fiercely coveted by the highest echelons of British society. Members of Parliament, senior diplomats, military aristocrats, influential media magnates, and prominent industrialists. When these individuals crossed the threshold of her suite, they did not perceive themselves as entering a compromised geopolitical environment or engaging with a foreign intelligence operative acting as a proxy for a hostile fascist state. Instead, they believed with profound and systemic arrogance that they were merely participating in an exclusive high society social ritual, entirely insulated from consequence by their own perceived inherent superiority and class privilege. The structural genius of this specific intelligence architecture lay in its absolute reliance on the voluntary complicity of the target demographic. Hohenlohe, possessing the clinical acumen of a master psychological profiler, recognized that the British ruling class possessed an insatiable, almost pathological vulnerability to vanity, social sycophancy, and the desperate need for peer validation. She correctly diagnosed that this elite demographic harbored a deep-seated psychological imperative to demonstrate their proximity to power, to boast of their inside knowledge of classified state affairs, and to perform their geopolitical relevance before an audience that possessed the requisite aristocratic pedigree to validate their self-worth. In the presence of a princess who confidently claimed direct, intimate access to the chancellery in Berlin and who functioned as a personal confidant to Adolf Hitler, the British elite willingly, even eagerly, surrendered highly classified political intelligence. The mechanics of this intelligence extraction were terrifying precisely because of their absolute simplicity and their complete legality. No government safes were cracked, no classified dossiers were physically purloined from Whitehall. The intelligence was freely offered in the form of unguarded dinner table conversation, boastful political prognostications over crystal glasses of champagne, and the careless, egotistical dissemination of internal government friction. Hohenlohe operated as a highly sophisticated geopolitical sponge within this echo chamber of appeasement. She possessed the exceptional analytical capacity to synthesize disjointed fragments of aristocratic gossip, parliamentary maneuvering, private doubts of cabinet ministers, and diplomatic indiscretions into a coherent, highly actionable intelligence mosaic. She systematically mapped the sociological topography of the British leadership. The data she extracted did not consist of troop movements or naval deployments. It consisted of the exact psychological state of the British establishment. She documented their existential terror of a second European conflict, their overwhelming willingness to offer territorial concessions to maintain the economic status quo, their deep-seated internal factional divisions regarding foreign policy, and their paralyzing fear of domestic socialist movements. This qualitative data was then systematically codified and transmitted directly to the highest command structures in Berlin, specifically to the desks of Joachim von Ribbentrop and Adolf Hitler. For the strategic planners of the Third Reich, this sociological intelligence was exponentially more valuable than traditional military blueprints. It provided a real-time, high-fidelity psychological map of the enemy's leadership, empirically confirming the Nazi hypothesis that the British political will was paralyzed by class preservation, ideological confusion, and an overwhelming desire to avoid military confrontation at any conceivable cost. The most damning historical indictment of this specific operational phase is directed not at the ingenuity of the operative, but at the profound systemic paralysis of the British early warning mechanisms. The domestic security apparatus, bound by its own institutional biases, was structurally incapable of identifying, let alone neutralizing, this specific vector of threat. The prevailing cognitive framework of the British establishment dictated that treason and subversion inherently originated from the lower socioeconomic classes, from foreign communist agitators, or from the ideological left. The terrifying concept that the absolute highest strata of British society, the very individuals legally and morally entrusted with the defense of the realm, were functioning as a collective, voluntary fifth column, was simply outside the cognitive paradigm of the intelligence services. Because the flow of classified information was masquerading as elite social discourse, it was granted absolute immunity from scrutiny. The Dorchester network thus operated with catastrophic impunity, entirely shielded by the impenetrable, invisible armor of aristocratic privilege. It flawlessly executed one of the most devastating non-kinetic intelligence operations of the pre-war era, proving definitively that a nation's most guarded secrets are rarely stolen by force. Rather, they are most frequently surrendered by a ruling class that values its own social elevation and elite networking above the fundamental survival and security of the state it governs. The Salon became the slaughterhouse of British strategic advantage, and the elite themselves eagerly provided the blade. In the structural analysis of international relations during the fragile interwar epoch, traditional diplomatic architecture operated upon a foundation of reciprocal protocols, recognized bureaucratic hierarchies, and formal state-to-state communications. However, the Third Reich, functioning as an aggressively revisionist and fundamentally disruptive geopolitical entity, acutely recognized the inherent friction and institutional inertia embedded within these orthodox channels. The British Foreign Office, despite its prevailing inclination toward appeasement, still possessed procedural safeguards that could stall or complicate the rapid ideological penetration desired by Berlin. to systematically bypass this bureaucratic labyrinth and establish a direct, unfiltered conduit to the central nervous system of the British establishment, the Nazi state required the deployment of a highly sophisticated shadow diplomatic apparatus. Within this clandestine operational matrix, Princess Stéphanie von Hohenlohe was definitively transitioned from a mere opportunistic socialite into an institutionalized, state-sanctioned proxy of the highest order. Her elevation represents a terrifying case study in how a totalitarian regime can successfully fabricate diplomatic authority and enforce its recognition upon a hostile yet profoundly compromised foreign power. The operational efficacy of a shadow diplomat is fundamentally tethered to their verified proximity to the absolute center of gravity within the directing state. The Nazi command structure, possessing a masterful comprehension of psychological manipulation and the mechanics of elite perception, meticulously engineered Hohenlohe's public profile to broadcast an aura of untouchable authority. Extensive archival documentation from the mid to late 1930s provides irrefutable visual and administrative evidence of this state-sponsored elevation. She was frequently documented accompanying the absolute apex of the Nazi hierarchy, photographed in close convivial proximity to Hermann Göring, Joachim von Ribbentrop, and most crucially, Adolf Hitler himself. The Führer's highly publicized designation of her as his dear princess was not an expression of sentimental attachment. It was a deliberate, ruthlessly calculated injection of geopolitical currency into her operational profile. When the media magnates, parliamentarians, and aristocrats of London engaged with Hohenlohe, the Nazi state ensured they implicitly understood a critical reality. They were not speaking to a peripheral envoy, but rather establishing a direct, unmediated neurological link to the supreme command of the Third Reich. Her physical presence in London was transfigured into the physical embodiment of the Führer's will. The most definitive and materially damning evidence of her institutionalized status within the fascist state apparatus was the extraordinary real estate transaction involving Schloss Leopoldskron. This monumental, historically significant Baroque palace located in Salzburg, Austria, had been the property of Max Reinhardt, a globally renowned theater director of Jewish descent. Following the geopolitical catastrophe of the Anschluss in 1938, the annexation of Austria into the Greater German Reich, the Nazi state immediately initiated the ruthless, systematic application of its Aryanization laws, expropriating Jewish assets with industrial efficiency. Schloss Leopoldskron was consequently seized by the state. However, in an act of breathtaking ideological hypocrisy that perfectly encapsulates the Nuremberg paradox previously analyzed, this stolen architectural masterpiece was not repurposed for traditional state administrative functions or military use. Instead, acting upon the direct personal authorization of Adolf Hitler, the estate was allocated to Stéphanie von Hohenlohe, a woman who, according to the regime's own foundational racial doctrines, shared the exact biological classification as the man from whom the property had just been violently stolen. This state-sponsored allocation of stolen property was not a mere reward for past intelligence services. It was a massive infrastructural investment in her ongoing diplomatic espionage operation. Schloss Leopoldskron was immediately weaponized, functioning as the continental hyper-opulent counterpart to her London Dorchester network. The Nazi regime recognized that to finalize the psychological subjugation of the British appeasement faction, they required a staging ground that completely overwhelmed the senses, an environment that perfectly synthesized the terrifying absolute power of the totalitarian state with the archaic, reassuring aesthetic of European nobility. Hohenlohe, backed by limitless state funding, transformed the expropriated palace into an elite diplomatic salon, hosting extravagant galas and highly confidential strategic summits. It is within the grand halls of this stolen palace that the sheer sociopathic moral bankruptcy of the British elite compromise is laid bare for historical judgment. Prominent British dignitaries, influential policymakers, and aristocratic appeasers willingly traveled to Salzburg to partake in Hohenlohe's hospitality. These individuals, representing the leadership of the world's foremost democratic empire, were fully and unavoidably cognizant of the mechanisms through which their host had acquired the estate. They were dining in a palace systematically looted from a marginalized citizen by a brutal expansionist dictatorship. Yet, the historical record demonstrates that their moral cognitive dissonance was absolute and impenetrable. The aesthetic grandeur of the aristocratic setting, the impeccable vintage of the champagne, and the intoxicating proximity to the absolute epicenter of continental power effectively sanitized the underlying brutality of the regime. The British elite willingly suspended their ethical faculties, allowing the veneer of royal hospitality to blind them to the structural violence that made such hospitality possible. By elevating a marginalized Jewish-born commoner to the status of an international power broker housed in an expropriated palace, the Nazi regime demonstrated a terrifying, almost mocking mastery of psychological warfare. They successfully forced the British establishment to recognize, legitimize, and negotiate with an entirely fabricated diplomatic entity. Hohenlohe's authority didn't stem from international law, democratic consensus, or traditional diplomatic credentials. Her authority was entirely derived from the fascist state's willingness to endorse her and the British elite's pathetic, class-driven desperation to be included in her exclusive orbit. The Berlin nexus, anchored by the stolen grandeur of Schloss Leopoldskron, functioned as the ultimate trap. It definitively proved that the architects of the Third Reich did not need to physically conquer the minds of the British leadership. They merely needed to lease an opulent palace, install a fraudulent princess, and allow the inherent vanity and ideological cowardice of the democratic elite to accomplish the work of subversion for them. In the structural analysis of the British Empire's geopolitical architecture during the 1930s, the institution of the crown did not merely function as a ceremonial relic or a passive symbol of national unity. It was the central stabilizing mechanism, the ultimate sovereign anchor designed to project imperial continuity and enforce domestic cohesion. Consequently, the unprecedented abdication crisis of 1936, which resulted in King Edward VIII renouncing the throne to marry Wallis Simpson, generated a catastrophic, systemic fissure within the British constitutional framework. The newly created Duke of Windsor was suddenly displaced from the apex of institutional authority, yet he retained massive symbolic capital, a sprawling network of aristocratic loyalists, and acute, festering personal grievances against the democratic establishment that had orchestrated his exile. To the aggressive, opportunistic intelligence apparatus of the Third Reich, this displaced sovereign was not viewed through the lens of a historical tragedy or a romantic exile. He was immediately classified as an unprecedented structural vulnerability. He was a highly weaponizable rogue geopolitical asset awaiting activation by a hostile power. The Strategic Command in Berlin theorized a highly classified long-term contingency protocol for the ultimate subjugation of the British Isles. Should direct military confrontation prove overly costly, or should the ongoing appeasement initiatives fail to secure British neutrality, the installation of a compliant, ideologically aligned puppet monarch would effectively decapitate British democratic resistance from the top down. To evaluate the viability of this macro-strategic objective, the Nazi state required a micro-tactical operation, a meticulously curated diplomatic intervention designed to measure the Duke of Windsor's susceptibility to fascist ideology, his geopolitical naivety, and his latent willingness to subvert the very constitutional government that had humiliated him. This necessitated an operational architect who could seamlessly navigate the hypersensitive egos of exiled royalty while simultaneously executing the ruthless directives of the totalitarian state. The traditional, bureaucratically rigid German diplomatic corps was fundamentally unequipped for such a delicate psychological capture. Once again, Princess Stéphanie von Hohenlohe, firmly entrenched as the supreme shadow diplomat of the Berlin Nexus, was deployed to architect the ideological grooming of a former king. Hohenlohe leveraged her intimate understanding of the Duke's psychological profile with devastating clinical precision. She recognized that his primary vulnerabilities were not financial or ideological, but rather rooted in profound vanity, intellectual shallowness, and a desperate, consuming craving for the sovereign deference that Whitehall had systematically denied him and his new Duchess. Operating through her extensive Dorchester network and utilizing the stolen grandeur of Schloss Leopoldskron as a staging ground, Hohenlohe helped engineer the parameters of the Duke's infamous 1937 tour of Nazi Germany. She brilliantly masked a high-stakes predatory intelligence operation beneath the innocuous, socially acceptable veneer of an aristocratic study tour. The invitation was framed not as a political summit that would trigger immediate constitutional alarms in London, but as an exclusive opportunity for the Duke to inspect German housing and labor conditions, effectively weaponizing his superficial interest in social reform as a vector for ideological penetration. When the Duke and Duchess of Windsor arrived in the Third Reich in October 1937, they were immediately enveloped in a masterclass of psychological warfare and state-sponsored pageantry. The Nazi regime deployed the full, overwhelming magnitude of its theatrical apparatus to disorient and seduce the target. They were greeted with SS honor guards, thundering military parades, and, most crucially, the absolute sovereign protocols and royal styling that the British democratic government had explicitly forbidden. Adolf Hitler, heavily briefed by Hohenlohe's continuous stream of sociological intelligence, played the displaced monarch with terrifying accuracy. The Führer validated the Duke's grievances, stroked his fractured ego, and projected the meticulously curated image of a disciplined, highly efficient anti-communist bulwark. The visual optics generated by this operation, most notably the catastrophic photographic evidence of the former British sovereign enthusiastically returning the Nazi salute, were not merely a transient propaganda victory for Joseph Goebbels. They represented the total empirical subjugation of the target's cognitive defenses. The strategic intelligence yielded from this geopolitical stress test was invaluable to the architects of the impending global conflict. The operation definitively confirmed to the Nazi high command that the Duke of Windsor was profoundly ideologically pliable, harboring deep sympathies for authoritarian efficiency and a paralyzing fear of Soviet communism that mirrored the anxieties of the broader British appeasement faction. More ominously, it proved that in the event of a successful German invasion of the United Kingdom, the former king possessed the requisite vanity and moral bankruptcy to serve as a collaborationist figurehead, an installed sovereign who would legitimize the fascist occupation and pacify the British populace. Through the orchestration of this tour, Hohenlohe and the Nazi intelligence apparatus had successfully compromised the ultimate symbol of the British Empire, transforming a former head of state into an active, albeit unwitting instrument of hostile foreign policy. The most damning historical indictment of this episode, however, must be directed at the structural impotence and institutional paralysis of the British government. The domestic security apparatus, MI5, and the Foreign Office closely tracked the orchestration of the 1937 visit, fully cognizant of its catastrophic geopolitical implications and the deep involvement of known fascist proxies like Hohenlohe. Yet the democratic state was completely paralyzed by an archaic, institutionalized deference to royal blood. The British government lacked the functional legal mechanisms and the political courage to restrain, publicly condemn, or formally prosecute a rogue member of the royal family for engaging in what was essentially a prolonged act of diplomatic treason. They were structurally forced to remain passive spectators as their former sovereign was openly courted, psychologically captured, and ideologically compromised by the very totalitarian dictatorship preparing to wage a war of annihilation against them. The Windsor operation stands as the absolute zenith of Stéphanie von Hohenlohe's espionage career, definitively proving that her methodology of weaponizing aristocratic privilege could breach the very highest echelons of global power. It brutally exposed the fatal flaw of a constitutional monarchy facing totalitarian subversion. When the ruling elite value the preservation of elite protocols and the shielding of royal prestige above the fundamental defense of the democratic state, the national security architecture collapses from within. The shadow diplomat had successfully orchestrated the ultimate betrayal, proving that the British crown itself was not immune to the intoxicating, destructive gravity of the fascist ideological orbit. In the macro-historical analysis of the late 1930s, the geopolitical architecture of the European continent experienced a terminal, irreversible rupture. The doctrine of appeasement, the prevailing diplomatic strategy heavily championed by the government of Neville Chamberlain and aggressively subsidized by the clandestine, high society machinations of the Dorchester network, was empirically and catastrophically falsified by the Wehrmacht's brutal occupation of Prague in March 1939. This overt kinetic aggression by the Third Reich obliterated the residual illusions of a negotiated diplomatic settlement. Within this rapidly collapsing geopolitical paradigm, the British domestic security apparatus, specifically the security service, was subjected to a forced, highly disruptive institutional awakening. For years, MI5 had been structurally paralyzed by an epistemological blind spot, an archaic, deeply ingrained institutional bias that dictated that existential threats to the crown originated almost exclusively from foreign communist agitators, domestic labor movements, or lower-class subversive factions. The terrifying realization that the absolute highest echelons of British society were functioning as a voluntary, transnational fifth column necessitated a radical recalibration of the nation's entire counter-espionage doctrine. The transition of MI5 from a state of passive deferential observation to a posture of active kinetic counterintelligence marked the definitive termination of Princess Stéphanie von Hohenlohe's operational viability within the United Kingdom. As the probability of global industrialized warfare transitioned from a theoretical possibility to an imminent logistical certainty, the Director General of MI5 and his senior operational architects initiated the systematic compilation of a comprehensive, devastating intelligence dossier. They authorized the deployment of aggressive surveillance protocols, including extensive wiretapping, the interception of diplomatic and personal correspondence, and the cultivation of informants within elite social circles that had previously been deemed politically impermissible against individuals possessing aristocratic pedigrees. Through this rigorous data collection, MI5 accurately diagnosed Hohenlohe not as a misguided, eccentric, aristocratic peacemaker, but as a hyper-efficient, state-sponsored intelligence node operating under the direct authorization of a hostile, totalitarian power. The internal, highly classified memorandums generated during this period famously and accurately designated her as the most dangerous woman in Europe, a bureaucratic classification that ruthlessly stripped away the glittering royal facade, exposing the lethal geopolitical machinery operating beneath it. However, the most analytically revealing and sociologically damning aspect of this historical phase is not the eventual operational efficiency of MI5's intervention, but the instantaneous sociopathic cowardice exhibited by the British elite upon realizing the shifting political winds. For the preceding half-decade, prominent aristocrats, influential media magnates, and senior parliamentarians had eagerly consumed her hospitality, utilized her exclusive diplomatic back channels to the Chancellery in Berlin, and basked in the reflected, socially validating glory of her manufactured royal status. Yet the precise moment the geopolitical calculus shifted from highly profitable appeasement to the existential, legally lethal threat of high treason, this sprawling network of voluntary collaborators evaporated with breathtaking orchestrated speed. The British ruling class, confronted with the encroaching jurisdiction of the security state and the prospect of wartime tribunals, executed a synchronized campaign of extreme self-preservation. The behavior of Lord Rothermere during this critical juncture provides the ultimate case study in the transactional nature of elite loyalty. Rothermere, who had previously retained Hohenlohe on a massive documented financial subsidy and had permitted her to effectively dictate the foreign policy editorial stance of his vast media empire, recognized that his extensive ideological and financial collusion with a newly classified Nazi operative could precipitate his immediate arrest under impending wartime emergency regulations. To avert the dismantling of his empire and his own potential prosecution, Rothermere initiated a frantic, ruthless campaign of historical revisionism. He abruptly terminated Hohenlohe's exorbitant retainer, severed all lines of communication, and deployed the full weight of his legal apparatus to obscure the depth of his prior financial engagements with her. He rapidly pivoted the editorial trajectory of the Daily Mail away from fascist sympathy, attempting to retroactively sanitize his legacy and reintegrate himself into the newly mobilized anti-German national consensus. This cowardly behavioral pattern was systematically replicated across the entire spectrum of the London elite. The very individuals who had enabled, celebrated, and protected her infiltration, now recognized that the invisible protective shield of aristocratic privilege had entirely dissolved in the face of national mobilization. Their loyalty to the princess was empirically proven to be devoid of any genuine ideological commitment or personal fidelity. It was predicated exclusively upon her utility as a social asset and her ability to provide elite validation without consequence. When proximity to Hohenlohe transitioned from a coveted status symbol to a lethal legal liability, the elite demonstrated that their ultimate allegiance was solely to their own biological survival and the preservation of their generational capital. They abandoned the shadow diplomat with the same calculated ruthlessness with which they had previously embraced her. The final decisive action of the democratic state manifested not through a dramatic cinematic espionage confrontation, but through the cold, precise, and bureaucratic application of administrative law. In the late summer of 1939, as the outbreak of kinetic warfare became an absolute certainty, the British Home Office, acting upon the urgent, highly classified recommendations of MI5, activated its executive powers. The state issued a formal deportation order under the Aliens Order, legally classifying Stéphanie von Hohenlohe as an undesirable foreign national and a severe imminent threat to the security of the realm. This administrative decree represented a profound structural victory for the democratic apparatus. It signaled the critical moment when the state finally reasserted its absolute sovereignty over the transnational, compromised, and highly porous networks of the aristocracy. The deportation order effectively neutralized the weaponized title of princess. The British state, finally operating with ruthless clarity, recognized her true geopolitical reality. She was an active agent of the enemy, and her presence necessitated immediate excision. Her panicked flight from the United Kingdom marked the catastrophic collapse of the Berlin Nexus in London, a chilling historical warning about the lethality of ideological subversion when masked by elite social prestige. By September 1939, Europe was burning. The aristocratic playgrounds where Stéphanie had operated her intelligence network were turning into active war zones. Stripped of her royal shield and facing the imminent threat of MI5, the spy princess didn't panic. She pivoted. She executed a calculated tactical retreat across the Atlantic. Her new target was a wealthy, neutral, and fiercely isolationist host, ripe for parasitical infiltration, the United States of America. The American elite, with their deep pockets and unacknowledged obsession with European royalty, were about to meet their master. However, the structural realities of the American domestic security apparatus presented a fundamentally different operational environment compared to the initially paralyzing institutional snobbery of the British elite. Upon her arrival in the United States, Hohenlohe encountered an intelligence infrastructure that was not blinded by centuries of internalized deference to aristocratic titles. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, operating under the autocratic and highly paranoid directorship of J. Edgar Hoover, functioned with a ruthless, bureaucratic efficiency that stripped away the glittering veneer of continental nobility. Hoover's intelligence matrix immediately identified Hohenlohe not as a displaced socialite seeking asylum, but as a premier, high-value geopolitical threat, a highly contagious ideological pathogen entering the American bloodstream. The FBI instituted a comprehensive, multi-layered surveillance architecture, monitoring her communications, tracking her financial transactions, and meticulously documenting her attempts to penetrate the American political and media establishment. Despite this rigorous surveillance, the constitutional constraints of a democratic nation, not yet formally at war, severely limited the FBI's capacity to initiate kinetic preventative neutralization. Hohenlohe exploited this legal gray area, leveraging the lingering isolationist sentiments within the American elite to establish a fragile yet functional operational foothold in the New World. The geopolitical paradigm, however, violently shifted following the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. The United States' formal entry into the global conflict triggered an immediate systemic transmutation of its domestic legal framework. The transition from neutrality to total war granted the federal government absolute executive authority to neutralize perceived internal threats. Hohenlohe was instantaneously reclassified by the Department of Justice from a closely monitored foreign diplomat to an active, hostile enemy alien. In a decisive assertion of state sovereignty, the American government executed a mandate of ideological quarantine. She was physically apprehended, permanently stripped of her societal mobility, and systematically processed into the federal internment infrastructure, spending significant periods in facilities such as the Gloucester City Immigration Station and the Seagoville Detention Center in Texas. To the conventional observer, this carceral processing would signify the absolute termination of her operational capacity and the definitive victory of the democratic state over a fascist operative. Yet a rigorous structural analysis of her conduct within the American internment system reveals the terrifying resilience and adaptability of a master manipulator. Hohenlohe did not succumb to the punitive realities of incarceration. Instead, she executed a systemic, psychological subversion of the carceral administrative hierarchy itself. She recognized that a detention facility stripped of its barbed wire and armed guards is fundamentally just another bureaucratic structure governed by human administrators possessing their own psychological vulnerabilities. Utilizing the same parasitical tactics that had successfully compromised the British Foreign Office, she weaponized her fabricated aristocratic fragility against the American penal system. Within the confines of the internment camp, she transmuted her cell into a microcosm of her Dorchester salon. She systematically seduced the administrative staff, utilizing a calculated combination of aristocratic charm, intellectual intimidation, and the projection of profound victimization. She bypassed the rigid, egalitarian punitive structure of the camp by exploiting the inherent class biases of her captors, demanding and frequently receiving extraordinary privileges, specialized diets, and superior living conditions that were systematically denied to the broader, non-elite internee population. Most devastatingly, Hohenlohe weaponized the medical vulnerabilities inherent in the human condition. She orchestrated a highly sophisticated, continuously documented narrative of chronic, debilitating physiological distress, effectively paralyzing the camp's medical and administrative oversight committees. By manipulating medical diagnostic criteria and leveraging the ethical constraints of her captors against them, she transformed the American legal and medical bureaucracy into an unwitting instrument of her own liberation. This sustained campaign of psychological attrition and administrative manipulation ultimately yielded catastrophic institutional capitulation. Despite the FBI's exhaustive empirical documentation proving her status as a top-tier intelligence operative who had actively facilitated the expansion of the Third Reich. The American justice system's executive review boards succumbed to her manufactured fragility. Confounding the desperate protests of the intelligence community, Hohenlohe was granted a highly conditional yet structurally absolute parole. She was released from the physical confines of the internment architecture, utilizing medical necessity as the ultimate legal loophole to escape the consequences of her geopolitical treason. The successful subversion of the American carceral system by Stéphanie von Hohenlohe stands as a profound historical indictment of the vulnerabilities inherent within democratic, institutional frameworks. It empirically demonstrates that even a mobilized wartime state apparatus possessing absolute legal authority and comprehensive intelligence awareness can be systematically dismantled from within by an entity that understands how to exploit the psychological weaknesses of its administrators. The shadow diplomat did not require a military extraction to escape the consequences of her actions. She simply relied upon the predictable structural inability of a democratic bureaucracy to maintain its punitive resolve when confronted with the weaponized illusion of aristocratic suffering. She emerged from the kinetic phase of the Second World War not as a neutralized casualty of fascism, but as a supremely adapted parasite, having successfully survived the destruction of her original host, only to extract a final humiliating concession from the very nation tasked with dismantling the empire she had served. The unconditional capitulation of the Third Reich in May 1945 precipitated the total, catastrophic collapse of the fascist geopolitical architecture in Europe. In the immediate aftermath of this global conflagration, the victorious Allied powers initiated an unprecedented systemic effort to codify, quantify, and penalize the atrocities committed by the Nazi regime. The establishment of the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg represented a monumental paradigm shift in international jurisprudence, a formalized institutional attempt to subject the absolute architects of totalitarian aggression and industrialized genocide to the rigid constraints of a legal and moral reckoning. The highest-ranking surviving functionaries of the Nazi state, field marshals, state ministers, and the bureaucratic engineers of the Holocaust, were systematically processed through this judicial apparatus. Their ideological fanaticism and structural violence meticulously documented before the global public, culminating in a series of executions and lifelong incarcerations. This post-war consensus was theoretically designed to serve as the ultimate universal deterrent, a definitive historical declaration that complicity in systemic geopolitical evil would yield inescapable lethal consequences. However, a rigorous structural analysis of this post-war judicial framework reveals a profound, highly calculated epistemological blind spot. The Allied tribunals were exclusively calibrated to prosecute the overt, kinetic manifestations of state power, the authorization of military invasions, the logistical administration of concentration camps, and the drafting of explicitly genocidal legislation. The international justice system possessed neither the legal lexicon nor the institutional willpower to conceptualize, let alone prosecute, the insidious non-kinetic mechanics of high society espionage, psychological manipulation, and elite diplomatic subversion. It is within this massive, unacknowledged jurisdictional void that the historical trajectory of Princess Stéphanie von Hohenlohe achieves its final, most devastating, and structurally unjust phase. the individual who had operated as the supreme shadow diplomat of the Berlin Nexus, the operative who had systematically paralyzed the early warning systems of the British Empire, manipulated the Fourth Estate, and actively engineered the appeasement protocols that facilitated the outbreak of global warfare, completely and effortlessly evaded the mechanisms of post-war retribution. The impunity granted to Hohenlohe was not an administrative oversight or a failure of intelligence gathering. It was the result of a deliberate, unspoken institutional consensus driven by the absolute imperative of elite self-preservation. By 1945, the intelligence directorates of both the United States and the United Kingdom possessed exhaustive, incontrovertible documentary evidence detailing her extensive collaboration with the absolute apex of the Nazi hierarchy. Yet to subject Hohenlohe to a public, international tribunal would have necessitated the catastrophic exposure of her operational network. A rigorous cross-examination of her pre-war activities would have inevitably dragged the highest echelons of the British and American establishments into the judicial spotlight. It would have publicly documented how Lord Rothermere voluntarily surrendered the editorial independence of the Daily Mail to a fascist proxy, how the British aristocracy eagerly consumed her stolen hospitality at Schloss Leopoldskron, and how the Duke of Windsor, the former sovereign of the British Empire, was successfully ideologically groomed by her intelligence initiatives. The democratic elites recognized with sociopathic clarity that prosecuting the shadow diplomat would effectively mean prosecuting themselves for their own voluntary systemic complicity in the rise of the Third Reich. Consequently, a silent transatlantic amnesty was functionally instituted. The royal facade, which had previously served as a weapon of infiltration, was now repurposed as an impenetrable shield against historical accountability. This is the ultimate grotesque paradox of Stéphanie von Hohenlohe. While millions of people sharing her exact Jewish heritage were stripped of their humanity and systematically murdered by the very regime she served, the honorary Aryan walked away untouched. This Jewish-born commoner, armed with a fake royal title, manipulated the Third Reich and the British Empire, only to emerge from the ashes of World War II not just alive, but wealthy and unpunished. It is a chilling reminder of a brutal truth. In the highest echelons of power, the ultimate shield isn't innocence. It's the right social credentials. Her survival stands as a chilling, empirical refutation of the concept of universal justice. It brutally demonstrates that within the macro structures of global power, ideological purity and legal accountability are frequently subordinated to the pragmatic realities of elite networking and the enduring cross-cultural currency of aristocratic privilege. In the decades following the cessation of hostilities, Hohenlohe did not retreat into obscurity or assume a posture of historical penitence. Possessing a terrifying sociological resilience, she seamlessly reintegrated into the transatlantic elite ecosystem that had ostensibly just fought a war of annihilation against fascism. During the 1950s and 1960s, she relocated between luxury residences in New York, Washington, D.C., and the continent, utilizing the exact same methodologies of psychological manipulation and social sycophancy to cultivate a new generation of power brokers. She established highly lucrative consulting arrangements with post-war media magnates, most notably the West German publishing billionaire Axel Springer, serving once again as an exclusive gatekeeper and international liaison. The democratic establishment demonstrating a profound structural amnesia eagerly welcomed her back into their drawing rooms. The fact that she had formerly operated as the Führer's dear princess was dismissed as a minor eccentric historical footnote, entirely overridden by her ongoing utility as a facilitator of elite socialization. Princess Stéphanie von Hohenlohe expired in 1972 in Geneva, Switzerland, having lived the entirety of her post-war existence in absolute luxury, entirely insulated from the consequences of her geopolitical treason. The closure of this historical dossier serves as a definitive, unforgiving autopsy of the Western power structure. Her narrative is not merely the biography of an exceptionally skilled operative. It is a damning indictment of the ruling class itself. It proves with lethal finality that the most catastrophic vulnerabilities within democratic nations are generated not by external military supremacy, but by the internal vanity, the ideological cowardice, and the intense class preservation instincts of the elites who govern them. Furthermore, her ultimate evasion of justice codifies a terrifying historical axiom. In the highest echelons of international relations, the system is fundamentally designed to immunize those who possess the correct social credentials. The shadow diplomat survived and indeed thrived because she perfectly understood that while regimes may collapse and ideologies may be defeated, the profound sociopathic arrogance of the global elite remains forever invincible.